I'm Sarah Lefebvre. I'm a games-based learning professional, and I specialise in corporate learning for longer than I care to remember. And more recently, within the last sort of 15 years or so, I've been very much focused on games-based learning. And more recently than that, have moved away from the kind of purely sort of business-based learning to learning still for corporates around sustainability, climate change, ecosystem degradation, and other kinds of systemic problems, social problems as well, things like racism and inequality. I'm also the editor of Ludagogy magazine, and it's Ludagogy magazine that is organising on all of these sessions, and they're being organised as a tie-in with the current issue, which is all about prototyping and playtesting. Hence, we're holding all these sessions, which are game demos, prototypes, or playtests. The magazine is now out. It was out on Sunday. So as well as all these sessions that are going on, do make sure you put aside some time to go and read some of the articles. And Terry is one of the people who is not only running a session for us as part of the tie-in, but has also written an article this month, which is all about, I can't remember, was it playtesting or prototyping?
Yeah, it's kind of both.
Yeah, a bit of both.
To this product, so yeah.
Yep. So linked in with the game he's going to be showing us now. So Terry is passionate about the power of games and gamification in learning, and he regularly weaves the principles of games-based learning into the learning experiences that he creates. Through his business, Untold Play, he offers fun, engaging, and immersive learning experiences, many of which have been award-winning. He's a longtime friend of Ludagogy magazine and has contributed numerous articles, as well as the one I've just mentioned. And the latest one, which I recommend you have a look at, I've got it written down here. I said I didn't remember what it was about. It was about, gives us Terry's insights on Jesse Schell's 6 questions on playtesting. So with that, Terry, take it away.
Fantastic. Thanks very much.
Hello, Brian.
Hi, Brian. Welcome. Thanks very much, Sarah. No, and yeah, great intro. I hate introducing myself and talking about exactly, all the things that I've done. So it's great to have someone else do it. But I do like talking about the things that I love to do and the things that I'm doing now, and that's what I'm going to be talking to you about, particularly in relation to this product. One of the things that I kind of fell most in love with over the years, both in terms of playing games, but also in terms of my career in learning design, and particularly in games-based learning design, is card decks. And I've got a huge box of different decks for creativity, tools for behavioral science, and applying behavioral science nuggets to different kinds of things that you want to get people to do, all kinds of different decks of cards. And that's kind of part of what inspired the Transform deck that we'll be talking about today. And I think that there is a real kind of power in those kind of card decks. One of my favorite stories about those kind of things is that Dmitry Mendeleev, I think I pronounced it right, who was the inventor of the periodic table, actually kind of created the periodic table, which you see on every chemistry classroom wall, from a deck of cards. He knew that there was a connection between the different elements and the different weights and different properties, but he didn't quite know what that was. And he moved a deck of cards that he'd made with these elements on one per card around the place until he started to see different patterns, and that kind of process of playing with those cards gave rise to the periodic table that we see now, which I think is really inspiring. And that's kind of partly what the kind of thing, kind of inspiration, maybe not such a huge invention that spans all of kind of society across the world, but for your own sparks of inspiration. That's what the Transform deck that we're going to talk about today is really kind of about, sparking that kind of moment of seeing something change from something to something else. So I mean, we'll do this fairly informally. Definitely, feel free to break in with a question or a comment as we're going. It'll be a little bit more me telling you about how the kind of deck developed and how it works to begin with. So a bit more me talking towards the start, but definitely as we move on, chance for you to think about some of the ways that you might use it, and we can even take some of your perhaps challenges in designing learning experiences or any kind of learning content that you're working with, and see if we can apply the deck to those challenges here and now as part of the session. So definitely more involvement as we go along, but anytime you want to stop things and say kind of, hang a sec, does this mean that? Feel free to do so. Or if it's something you like to comment on but you don't want to interrupt things, feel free to drop a comment in the chat at any time. So actually, what might help just a tiny little bit before we start there is, as we've got so few people, I wasn't going to do this if we had loads of people, but we've just got the 4 of you, which is fantastic. It's a nice, cozy little group. But if we just very quickly say that, go around, and if I could hear from each of you the kind of learning content that you tend to work with, that would just be useful, because then I could make maybe a couple of references and links with the things I'm talking about as we go. So on my screen, you're in the order James, Phil, Sherry, and Brian. So James, what kind of learning content do you tend to work with?
So in my current business, I'm part of a learning design team, because we have quite a large workforce. But I suppose most of the learning content that we've had before has been more traditional. I suppose more quite a lot of it's quite a lot of it's PowerPoint based and things like that. So what we've been trying to do since I joined is push it more towards learning experiences. So this is why I'm really interested in this deck, because I'd love to introduce some like gamified elements either to the face-to-face content or like the e-learning and digital content that we try and create.
Sure. And in terms of kind of topic areas, it sounds like quite a wide range.
It's a huge range, yeah. Everything ranging from how to do your day-to-day job to some of the more behavioural things for management and so on.
Brilliant. Okay, thanks, James. Phil?
Hi, yeah. I do a lot of work on team development. So a lot of that is really conversational based, and I'm forever telling people I work with that I don't want to see their slides or use their slides, because actually people just want to talk. So in face-to-face, I'm a big fan of the Post-it. So walls will be covered in Post-its, and I've been running exercises and team sessions. Online, I'm a fan of the Zoom tools. I really like using chat. I really like using whiteboards. And if I need more than that, I'll go to Miro and build content for people to use in Miro. And I'm really fascinated by some of the Miro wizards out there in the Miroverse, I think it's known as, and some of the games they can build in there are really blowing my mind. And I kind of think it's the future. You know, Brian's kind of my work dad, and I grew up on games being the way for people to learn. So yeah, it's just the way that people learn most effectively. So I love the thought of this session.
Perfect. Thanks, Phil. Sherry?
Fantastic, you all. I am a health and wellness speaker and coach. So that's the area. When I go into corporations, it is about developing a wellness culture and teaching about, energy, productivity, those types of things from a physical and mental health standpoint. Individually with people, it's behavior change, creating healthy habits. In fact, this weekend, I'm leading a retreat. And I was so excited, Terry, that you were doing this, because I've got all of my agenda planned, all my interactions planned. And I thought, if I can add a little bit more game to this, a little bit more something fun that's not silly, it's like it'd be fun to pick that up even before the deck comes out. And I am going to be the first person in the US to get the deck, just so you know, not Mary, our friend. Fantastic. And then the other area I'm really, really interested in using this is in social media content, making that more interactive, so that it's not just, hey, here's a piece of inspiration or here's a piece of motivation, but getting people to engage with it in a gamified way.
Interesting. Great. Thanks, Sherry. Brilliant. Brian?
I've spent many years building games for use in corporate training. Lots of them were board games teaching finance and competitive strategy and things like that. But a lot of them are sort of role play type interactions between people, where they're actually building a product and delivering it to a customer who's a live human rather than anything symbolic. So everything from board game simulations, computer simulations, role play exercises, whole range, people topics, leadership and teamwork topics, technical topics like finance, and quite a range.
Brilliant. Okay, great. Thanks, Brian. Excellent. So really good to hear where people are coming from. Obviously, a lot of you really already on this train or been on it for quite a while of making content less PowerPointy, less boring, less straightforward, and more active based. But I do think one of my ideas with a tool like this was, even when I myself, I've been on that train for a long time. It's sometimes just finding different ways and new ways, and inspiring yourself to do that. So this is definitely a tool that's designed for people who are already kind of doing that, but just want to find different and new ways and spark inspiration, maybe shape themselves out of the way they themselves have always been doing it, even if that way is a really interesting way. But it's also designed for people who perhaps at the moment are on a much earlier stage of that journey and are making a lot of basic kind of presentation-based learning, with just communicating content and expecting people to soak it up and that kind of end of things as well. So, okay, let me show you a little bit more about let me show you the deck itself. So I'm really, really pleased after all the work that I put into it to see, and if any of you saw any of my posts on LinkedIn or the article, to see the cards, the deck in the flesh, made by a professional printer. This has been something that's been kind of a labor of love for me for quite a while now. To see it in a kind of box that I can open and I can play around with the cards, if I can open the box, is great. But in terms of today's session, in order for you to see what's going on and for me to not have to kind of hold these cards up to the camera the whole time, we're going to actually be using Mural and some PDF versions of these cards to look in on. But it is designed more as a physical tool rather than as a digital tool. I'll talk a little bit later about how there's a kind of digital option that can kind of be used, particularly if you're going to be collaborating with people using the deck and if they're not in the same space as you. But the primary kind of way it was designed was as a physical tool. So let me share my screen here. So this is the PDFs. You can't see any of the detail here, I'm sure, but of the deck as a whole. So what the deck consists of is 45 cards in the core deck, as well as 7 kind of instructional cards or guide cards that help you work out ways to use the deck. So I'll kind of guide you around all this, and I'll zoom into some of it, but just to give this the kind of overview of what's in the deck. So there's these 45 individual cards divided into suits. I'll say more about the suits, and then some instructional cards to help you see different ways that you can manipulate and arrange and use the deck. And it kind of the article that's in this month's Ludogaming magazine says more about kind of how I developed this deck, but just very briefly on that, it kind of came out of me in a long career of designing learning experiences, finding myself using similar tricks again and again sometimes, but then sometimes reinventing the wheel, because perhaps I did something 2 or 3 years ago and then I've forgotten where I'd done that or exactly how I'd done it, and having to go back and find it or start all over again, and started to keep a bit of a log, first of all as a Trello, and then later on as a kind of spreadsheet divided up into different categories and using more and more information in different fields. And these kind of categories and fields gave rise to the idea that actually if these were individual cards, all these different kinds of activity or exercises, then actually it would be really, really kind of compelling to use and easier to start combining these ideas as well. So I'm just going to show you. So the experience that anyone will get when they open the deck is just first of all looking at the kind of this very first cards, transform your learning content into engaging activities with these cards. And that's the core of it really. So each card is a way to take a piece of learning content that, the boring way to do it would be, okay, here it is on a slide, and listen and ask questions if you want, and then transform it into some other way of getting that content across. And the more options you've got, the better. It might well be that you can't use all of the 45 options in the deck, but you don't need to use 45 for one piece of content. You just need to find the one, or maybe the combination of a couple that will really make it work for you. So that's where the journey kind of starts. But then the core part of the deck is each of these cards. And if I just zoom in, you'll see what is on each of the cards. So if we have a look, this is the front, and just below it, a back. So here's the card that's a way to take a piece of learning content and do something with it. So in this case, it's pros and cons. So you can get learners to think about and list the pros and cons of various options. And then on each card on the front, as well as what the card is, it says a little bit about why it might be useful, a little bit of a kind of case for that as a good way to use in a session. So by specifying that learners must think about both, you make their evaluation more balanced. And also there's these numbers, which we'll go into in a bit more depth later, but they're different cards that it plays well with, that it combines well with. Also a little bit about the suit, which we'll talk more about later. And then on the back, just to try and give you a little bit more help if you're not familiar with that way of doing things. So this one, for instance, pros and cons. If you're an experienced designer of learning experiences, I'm sure you've used this method or something like it. And that's fine. There's quite a few cards in the deck that are really familiar, that are really simple. There's brainstorming, there's role playing, there's these really kind of straightforward things that in a way that lots of people will have come across. But the idea with having those in is that you can start to think about how they might combine with others, things like that. And then there are also more complex ones. And so for the more complex ones in particular, then on the back, it says a little bit about an example to help you see how it might come to life. So there's an example of how pros and cons could be used in delegation. And there's some tips about how to use it well in my experience. So this is all based on my experience of using this in session design and session delivery. That's just kind of showing you just very briefly what you'd see on opening the box and what's on a card. What I'll go through fairly quickly is showing you how that might then be used to transform a particular piece of learning. Is there anything anyone wanted to kind of comment or question at this point? Very happy if any of that didn't make sense. You want to ask a question?
I'll probably just make a comment. They look fantastic, Terry, and I completely get the idea of gathering your thoughts in terms of how you design into one place, because I'm probably at a much earlier stage than you, where I am on that spreadsheet at the moment, where ideas that have worked in facilitation before, I'm kind of noting them so I can revisit them. But I love the idea of the physical cards.
Great, fantastic. Thanks, James. Yeah, and what I found actually, even myself, even the jump from a spreadsheet, which I was using and was great for me, to jump to cards and then use the cards myself, has helped me to be more flexible and get more interesting ideas together. So, yeah. Fabulous. Okay, so I'll just talk about a couple of examples so we can see how that might work in practice. So the simplest way is you just take one card, and there's different ways you might choose which card, which we'll see. You just take one card and transform a single piece of learning content using that card. So for instance, if we were to take a piece of content that was, I'm not going to go into too much depth about this, obviously you would probably have more specific information about the content, but if it was a piece of content about management and leadership styles, then a couple of cards that you could use that, very quick examples. One here, populate the model, which is learners populate a visual representation of a model with examples. So, you know, I've quite often used something like this for not just management leadership styles models, anything where there's different styles or preferences or personality types. And, you know, just to help it seem a little bit less theoretical, you're putting that up, perhaps, you know, if we want to keep Phil happy with a post-it obsession, which I also share, then, you know, you have that on a wall and you start moving post-its around and getting people to put a post-it of Margaret Thatcher is perhaps this learning style, whereas, you know, Obama is this leadership style, and so on and so forth. So populating the model as one way to kind of tackle that content and look through it. Obviously, I know that learning objectives are really important here. And again, I'm not going to be talking too much about a specific objective, but this works at, I think, at a more inspirational level. Once you've got inspired with an idea, you need to actually then build it into something that will specifically meet your learning objective, or you could start with the learning objective as the thing that you're aiming towards by looking at the card. And then customize an avatar would be another one that you could use. So learners create or customize a character that represents themselves, obviously coming from video games. But, you know, if you get people to characterize themselves as a management or leader in terms of their style, that's another idea. And you can take that in lots of different directions. That could be visual, could be from scratch, them creating their own, could actually be them you know, choosing for a number of options of accoutrements that manager or leader has that represent different styles and ways of doing things, you know, or different clothing that represent the same thing. So lots of things you could do with that. And again, these are just ideas. If you don't like them, there are 42 other possible ideas, 43, sorry, in the deck. So that's just an idea of how it might work on a single card level. Again, jump in with any questions. But then I'll just show you the different So what these grey cards are really all about, apart from that introductory card, is 6 different ways that you could then move the cards around, play with them, and thereby kind of choose or focus on certain cards or combination of cards. So I'm not going to read through all of these by any means. What we will do is go through a little bit, some examples of how you might use the first 3, and then I'll briefly talk about what the other 3 are about. Remember, these are all backs and fronts, so there's not 12 cards, sorry, not 14 cards that you're looking at here, there's actually only 7. But yeah, so lots of different ways, and you could say, okay, I'm going to use this way, whichever you like. And they do kind of progress from left to right. So you've got the easiest beginner level ones on the left, and then moving across to more advanced and complex ways to manipulate the cards. So I'm just going to, briefly show some examples for each of these first 3. And then maybe we'll do things a little bit more flexibly and open things out so that you can start to kind of play and get involved a little bit more. Pick a card is just what it says in the tin. Choose a card at random. Consider how it could transform your learning. Could it work with your content? And again, there's more tips about how you could use this and so on. I won't go into too much depth. But as an example of that in practice, the first method there, just picking a card, you might have a piece of content on organizational values. So, you've got these organizational values, you want to embed them in the culture of the organization you're working with, or get people to think more about them and start to identify where they happen or when they're not happening. So here's 6 cards that I picked out, 1 from each suit, although I'm not really talking about the suits just yet, but I will in a sec. And, again, just suggesting. So you could stage a debate. You could say, okay, we've got our 5 organizational values, and you're going to debate why value A is the best, and you're going to debate the point of why B is the best, and you're going to say why C is the best, and so on. Stage a debate on that basis. Or you could amplify and reduce. I really like this one. This is a really simple one, one of my favorite cards in the deck, actually. You get them to explore what would happen if variables were amplified or reduced. So, okay, in this scenario, what happens if we amplify our value of working together? Or what happens if we reduce our value of taking ownership, or whatever it might be. Overlapping silos, you could get, this is getting people to design separate pieces of a whole without quite communicating and then seeing how they fit together. So you could get people to design how their team might work really well if their process were designed around this value, and then a separate subgroup is designing around value B and a separate around value C, and then you bring them together and see where do they fit and where do they not fit. Or survey and compare, getting people to fill out a questionnaire and then charting and comparing the results. So with that one, perhaps you could get them to create a survey which shows which of the values are closest to their core values or how they behave on a daily basis, and then compare the results of that. Or a pre-mortem, so this is where learners imagine that something's gone wrong and then they start to review why. So for this one, perhaps for their values, we look at something that's gone wrong, or ask them to think, we've failed in our mission, we've failed in everything that we're trying to do as a team. In what ways did us not living our values contribute to this? How did we mess up specifically if we think about values? So again, they're just really quick. I'm trying to strike a little bit of a balance here between, not getting bogged down, but making sure that it's clear what I mean by each card. So let me know if I've skipped over any of those too quickly and you say, I don't really understand what that card means, or anything like that. Or just any other questions or thoughts or comments at this point. So that's the first way of working with it, really. Just pick a card, start to play with different cards and say, could this one work? Could this one work? Cool, fantastic. And again, remember each of these has a back. I'm not going to go all the time between front and back, but if you were playing with these cards, you could start to look at the front, look at the back for more inspiration. Remember the back has on examples and tips of best ways to use this, so you could be playing around with that the whole time. Okay, so let's pick a card. So the second of those, after pick a card, is combinations. So look out for 2 cards that can combine to transform one activity together. And this is where the links in the bottom box at the front of each card come in. So these, at the bottom of each card, you have 6 other cards that it plays well with. So 6. And it's not specified exactly, that's left to you to kind of see how you think they could merge together for your content. But these are 6 that I think work well with that card in general, or can often work well with the So you could just follow those links and lay 6 other cards around the card you're focusing on, or just pick one of them and put them together and play around with those combinations until you find one that works. So for instance, you've got a combination here of 2, and if you were looking at if you're looking at risk rating and mitigation, so you're rating a risk and trying to prioritize it and then mitigate it. Those are often very structural kind of bits of training where you have to follow a kind of process. So you could start with this branching paths card. So that's an activity, which is a way to look at stages of a process and say, okay, at this stage of a scenario or process, do you choose option A or B? If any of you remember the choose your own adventure books where, do you kill the goblin or do you talk to him? That kind of stuff. And then, that suggests a number of combos that work well with it. And one of them was card 23 there, storytelling, where you get learners to create a story around prompts. So actually the combination there for risk rating could be that learners are navigating the scenario of, do you give it this risk rating or this risk rating, and do you mitigate it in way A or way B? And then after they've navigated it, they have to tell the story of how that actually works in practice. How does that really, bring it to life, breathe life into it as a story? So that's just one quick example combo. Or another one for the same topic could be critiquing an example, where learners critique a real life example, and matching, where learners match cases with categories or halves with missing other halves. So the combination of those for risk rating might be, for example, to critique a real life example of a risk that was really badly managed and things went wrong. And then when they've identified the 4 points perhaps at which something went wrong, then they have to match between these 4 or more different things could be slotted in there to fix that. And that's the ones that would work best in those slots. So again, just some quick combos, nothing too complex really in those combos, but just illustrating how you can start to take these kind of atoms, if you like, and start to combine them together. And it doesn't have to be limited to.
Terry, I have a question.
Yeah, please, Sherry.
No. Oh, on the, I thought you we're done with that. I apologize. Go ahead with what you were saying. Okay. On the back of the cards, this may be solved, but as an example of the branching, is that something where you're suggesting that whoever's leading this section would create either on Post-it notes or cards or, whatever physical thing, that here are the different scenarios? Do you kill the goblin or talk to the goblin? And then they pick, or is that something that you suggest people are just doing verbally? Does the back of the card walk you through how to do that?
Yeah, it's a great question, Sherry. Thank you. It gives me an opportunity to clarify something that I think is really important about this deck. So one of the things that I played with for a long time and kind of went both ways on was the balance between being really specific and saying this is exactly how this is done or could be done on the one end. So that's one end of the scale. And then on the other end of the scale for each of these, making it as broadly applicable as possible. So it could be applied to many different kinds of topics and situations and learning experiences, whether they be online or in real life, and all those kind of things. So I really wanted to get that balance. I didn't want people to be on one end kind of lost saying, I don't know how I would do this. But on the other end, I didn't want them to be thinking, well, this is so specific, it doesn't fit my circumstance. I wanted them to be a kind of abstraction in a way of a broad, each card to be an abstraction of kind of a broad family of very similar things. So for branching paths, I think absolutely you could do it on a number of different formats. You could, there are apps and programs that definitely, I think on the back of the card, let's see if I can just see the back of the card here. For this one, on the back of the card, I think it does list some of those. So so it talks about some of the apps there that you can use to do it online using a program, or you can create it as an e-learning document in a program like Articulate or Captivate, or those are just some examples though. But it also could be, I've done this as a paper exercise, for instance, where I'm actually giving people bits of paper, a little bit like them turning to page 275 in the Do You Kill a Goblin kind of book. So, I wanted to leave that flexibility so it could be done in a lot of different ways, give people just enough to help them see how it could be used. And that's why we've got an example there. but enough flexibility definitely that it would fit as many different ways of doing it as possible.
I think
Does that make
it's
sense, Sherry?
Yes.
I think that's a good example of where people could actually be creating their own stories as well, couldn't they? So they could actually be like making up those branches on the fly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, that's the whole idea behind that really, is to inspire you to be creative, and again, not to leave everything to you. You know, it's got to give you something, but for the real creative engine, I guess, to be you yourself to some extent. Excellent. Okay.
Thank you.
Any other questions on what we were just saying, or about the combos? Okay. So then the only other one that I'll just focus in on any depth is the third one here, which is the suits. And then I'll just briefly talk about what these other ones are. So the suits is these categories. And again, I did a lot of playing about different ways to categorize them. There's not really a kind of science or an existing model to the way that I have categorized them, but it's really about how I found them to be useful in terms of the kinds of things you're wanting learners to do. So each of the 5 suits is something you might want learners to do. And actually, I'll use the main deck itself to show the range of stuff here. So the first suit here is assess, which is really about, you know, getting them to use their sense of evaluation and assess things. And you can probably see just by flicking across the kind of things that are included there, how they're kind of linked in that way. So they're assessing and evaluating and giving their own judgment on various things. So that's the kind of activity that the learners are doing if you're focusing on that suit. Whereas the green second suit, arrange, is they're arranging things or looking at an arrangement or a structure. So it works well with things that are a structure, you know, learning content that is a structure, or that involves seeing the interrelationships and structures between things. So again, you can probably start to see from the titles there how that might be. And then create, as the third suit, the red one, is all about, you know, being really creative, sometimes from a completely blank slate or you know, in various channel directed kind of ways, but really the learners themselves following a creative kind of process. The fourth one, this purple, is solve. So some more structure that you as a kind of designer are putting to things where they have to solve or navigate. It's where a lot of the more games related stuff would fit in, that they have to actually kind of maximize their points or solve things or meet a win condition or something like that. So there's an actual kind of solution there and pieces of a puzzle and those kinds of things. And then finally, apply is very much about the practical, pragmatic end of things. You're actually asking them to apply skills and do things and try things out. So there's the 5 suits, if they make sense. Again, feel free to ask a question if they don't. And as an example of how you might use a suit, if you're learning content, what was I going to use here? Sorry, just notes. Yes, if your learning content was about performance management process or system, then you might look to the arrange suit. For instance, you might say, look, I think the arrange suit is going to be helpful here because we have a very formalized process for performance management within the organization, and we want to create some kind of learning experience to help them navigate and understand that structure, that process. So you'd look across those, and you might, and I'll just pick out a couple here, you might look at some of them and say, okay, yeah, customize the process. Learners annotate a process with keynotes or questions about it. So let's lay it out, the process, and then let them annotate with Post-its or with whatever their questions about it, or where they think it's strong, or where they think it could have problems with it, or where they think it would fit well with problems that they currently have, or those kind of things. Or you could get them to try and break the model. This is one of my favorite cards as well. I think sometimes when we try and help people understand models, we kind of hold them up as sacrosanct, this is right. But actually sometimes if you get them to try and break the model, then you're acknowledging that no model is perfect and you can problem solve the breakage. So here you could say, okay, when might this performance management system not work? And get them either just in a broad open way like that, or in a structured way to try and break it, and then say, okay, so what can we do about that? Or, you know, we already saw populate the model, so you could try and populate the stages with something there. Or just to as an easy familiarization at the start, you could get them to order the steps and say, okay, here's the jumbled up steps of the process. Which order do you think they would go in, as a way to explore? It's a nice simple So lots of different ways there, but that's how you'd focus using a suit. So if you've got any questions there, let me know. So I'll just very, very briefly, but I don't want to spend too much time here because I want to get onto the stuff where you can get a bit more involved. There's 3 other ways that are provided for here. So themes is where I've kind of chosen these groupings. I'll zoom in on those a little bit. So here are some cards that I think work really well around learning around writing skills or around people skills, or activities that are quite unusual and new and you know, will raise people's eyebrows or seem fresh, ones that are quick and easy generally, and so on and so forth. So different kind of categories of things besides the suits that you could just get those cards out of the deck and look around them and see which ones would work if your situation is one of the ones described there on the card. And I plan to add more themes via the forum that I'm going to talk about at the end. So those are just the ones that come with the deck. Very briefly, play as a game. I'm not going to go into too much depth about it unless you really want me to as a question. But it's kind of playing a very simple game, like a card game, like kind of whist or something, to take turns in a group, if you're working with this as a group of designers, and play cards out, and then use that play of cards one at a time to inspire combinations and ways to transform the content. And then finally, spreads, the most kind of advanced one, is where you've got a framework based on learning theory. So you might have, for instance, take a really simple one, Kolb's cycle of learning: do, reflect, learn, and test. Sure, many of you know that. If you don't, you know, it's kind of what it says on the tin. You get learners to do something, then reflect on it, then draw what learning they can from it, and then test out that learning. And you get those as 4 positions. And you say, we need a card for each position. How are we going to get them to do? How are we going to get them to reflect? How are we going to get them to learn? And how are we going to get them to test? And then you look through the deck and find which card, which activity would be best for each of those. So those are the other 3 ways. So I would love to get you involved and look at how some of these might match with some of your own kind of experiences or challenges. But any other kind of thoughts or questions about the deck as a whole now that I've shown it to you?
The only question that I have at this point, one of the things that, just thinking in terms of the retreat I'm leading this weekend, there are sections of it where this type of learning, where they're taking concepts and applying them and, you know, personalizing them. But when I'm initially presenting information that is completely new to them, are there cards that, okay, if you're going to be just flat out presenting something for 20 minutes and you don't want it to be a PowerPoint? Yeah. Other than opening it to Q&A like you've just done for us, because this is an example of that. You're presenting new information to us.
Sorry, was that the question? Sorry, Joe.
Yeah, that's the question, basically. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, in a way, that could be something that was there as a theme. So it's definitely something that I could add in as an extra theme via the forum that I'm going to mention at the end. So there are definitely cards for that. So for instance, you know, I just talked about how order the steps, for instance, is a good way. You know, if you've got a process, 6 steps, rather than say, here's the 6 steps and here's the order, give it to them jumbled up, they've got to put them in order. So that's just a nice simple one, and that works with that kind of presentation, trying to turn it into an activity. So there are definitely cards, I would say a number of cards throughout the deck that I think work in that context. At the moment, they're not really kind of marked out as such. So until or unless I produce extra themes, and one of which might focus on that, it'll be a question of you looking through and working out which ones would work for you in that way. But yes, is the short answer.
Okay, thank you.
Brian, you've got your hand up there.
Yes, I'd be very curious to see what the cards are on the apply end of things, because we've seen some of the others, but I don't think I've got much of a glimpse of that.
Sure. So, I mean, some of them are actually really about applying, as in literally doing. So, for instance, role play or trial and error, you know, setting people a task that they'll fail at, but then helping them learn why and try again. Some of them are a little bit more kind of planning to apply. So action planning, for instance, you know, so it's not actually applying necessarily there within the classroom, within the learning environment, but being very practical and pragmatic about exactly what you're going to do to put this into action. And again, I think that kind of contrast between those different ones is quite deliberate, because if you depending on the exact learning environment, and these cards are designed to be, for face-to-face training sessions, both long and short, online training sessions, potentially other kinds of learning environments where facilitator might not even be present, like e-learning. So, depending on all of that, you may or may not be able to use some of these for practical reasons. So the pragmatic application stuff, you might not actually be able to do it in the room. So maybe the next best thing is to plan how they're going to do it outside, for instance. The apply one's also an interesting one, because you can put it right at the start or right at the end. If we think back to Kolb's cycle, you can really start with the do the thing and then see what you learn from it, and that's often the best way, and that's a very game-based way. But you can also get them to really learn something and then do it and try it out. Is that helpful, Brian?
Yeah, great, thanks.
Anything else I want to ask about the card just before we maybe see how they might work with a challenge in particular? Fabulous. Okay, so just looking at what you said from the start. Well, does anyone have a particular kind of piece of learning content that right now perhaps they're working with, struggling with, want more inspiration on, that we could just maybe kind of see how the deck might work with that piece of content?
I've potentially got something that I'm working on at the moment. So one of the sessions I'm writing has a section on emotional intelligence and particularly self-awareness. And I'd love to like kind of explore maybe some ideas of how we could help people build self-awareness, or how we could get them to explore options for themselves in terms of building self-awareness.
Brilliant. Okay, so just in a real quick nutshell, so if you were going to do that as a kind of presentation, here's the content, well, in a real nutshell, try and keep it as brief as you can, what would be the actual kind of content?
I suppose for this one, we start with the traditional emotional intelligence model with the 4 different sections, focused in on self-awareness. And initially at the moment, I've got a bit of a questionnaire that I've put together for them to evaluate themselves is the starting point. And then currently where it goes after that is for them to start to, I suppose, brainstorm ideas in a group. So it does use potentially some of these cards, but in terms of what might work for them to push them to get a higher score on that particular questionnaire. That's currently where it's at, but in very, very draft form.
Sure. So there's specific things that the questionnaire covers that are really the things that you would recommend, or that you're kind of trying to get them to do more of for self-awareness?
Yeah.
Okay. So we could just go through and look at individual cards, but maybe, and tell me if I'm wrong, it maybe sounds a little bit like could have a look at that suit, for instance, the arranged suit, where you are looking at kind of structures and different arrangements, things, because you've got the initial arrangement of the emotional intelligence, but then you've also got this kind of different ways of doing things. So you've already got survey and compare there. Actually, I've done a lot of talking here. I'm going to shut up and see if you want to pick out any of those cards. Any of you, could be James, could be someone else.
I think the avatar one has a lot.
Say how you think they could fit. Go on.
I think the avatar one has a lot of potential.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So that's actually in the category below, but that's fine. Absolutely. Go on. So how could that fit?
So it kind of relates to something that I'm working on at the moment, which is to do, well, I won't say what it's to do with because it's long and complicated, but the idea that people start with an avatar which represents them as they are now, but they are working towards a better avatar of where they want to be in the future, with different characteristics and different traits and so on.
Fabulous. Great. Good idea. I'm going to take us back to the arranged suit just in case that is helpful, but yeah, we could definitely think about any of the cards that we've seen or can see. Anyone else looking at the screen and either can see an idea like Sarah just did, or maybe just want to see a question? Oh, hang on, what does that one do? Because I know they're all quite small at the moment.
One of them that kind of jumps out to me is the create a cheat sheet. I've not seen that one done before, so yeah, I'd like to have a look at that.
Yeah, so that's kind of quite near, often I think quite near the end of some learning where you're actually thinking about how they're going to retain it and so on. So it's summarizing key points from an experience, from some learning, whatever, and do it in a selective and interpretive way, kind of, rather than just a rote and regurgitation kind of way, ideally. And maybe you're inspiring them with, saying, look, you could do mnemonics, you could do ways of grouping information, you could do visual representations, etc. So, I mean, that could be a way to round off that activity in terms of a cheat sheet for me on self-awareness, definitely.
And from what Sarah was saying before, actually, the one with the avatar kind of sparks an idea, because at the moment there probably is a little bit too much talking in the session about what self-awareness is. It'd be quite nice for them to maybe create an avatar, which is a person with the highest score on self-awareness, for somebody who's maybe right at the very top of that score.
Yeah, so you could talk about that avatar and say, what does that person do? How do they behave? What do they say? How do they relate to other people?
Yeah, and maybe introduce some of the common situations, like how do they deal with conflict, maybe, or if they've got, let's say, an underperforming member of staff in their team, how does somebody with high self-awareness differ from someone with low self-awareness in terms of how they deal with it? Yeah.
Fantastic. And just while you're talking, I'm pulling out a couple myself, but I want to again give other people a chance to talk. I'm using the physical deck. This is something I quite like, because the physical deck is a bit harder on the screen, is you can just kind of leaf through it and say, oh, that one gives me an idea, that one gives me an idea. Yeah. Any other thoughts on anything you can see on the screen or anything we've talked about there?
Populating the model?
Yeah, one.
If you're starting with a particular model of emotional intelligence.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's 4 quadrants. Maybe you've got some examples of, people who do it well, people who do it less well. Yeah, absolutely. That populating the model one, I find you can do in lots of really diverse ways. You can use famous examples. You could have a scenario and show them a scenario, and then pull out the characters or instances from that scenario. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, I'm just going to mention a couple, just because it is difficult to kind of move around the screen, but I'm going to, I've just pulled out a few cards, and I've tried to pull out a few that are not obvious as well, just because one of the things that I think this deck does really well is it kind of helps you sometimes to think, I never would have thought that, but now that I've got that prompt in front of me of the card, and I'm trying to link it to my piece of content, I've just made a link that, I probably wouldn't have done otherwise. So I've got one here, if I zoom into it on the screen, actually that'll help. Trading game from the Solve suit. So this is where maybe learners try and reach a goal by trading resources with other learners. So maybe you could put together some kind of game where the goal is about self-awareness as rated by certain things, and then the resources they have to trade are different ways of increasing self-awareness. But the kind of twist, the reason that there's a trade in it, is because depending on the results of your questionnaire or whatever, some of these are going to be worth more to you than others. If you got high on this on questionnaire, then this one is going to be worth really loads to you. So you've got to do a bit of trading, and that'll help you to explore, and as it says there, force them to think about value and so on. I think it'll be quite fun. Or storytelling, we already looked at, but 3, storytelling. I find this one a really, really flexible one and really fun. So at any point during any of the kinds of processes that we've talked about already here, you could be getting them to tell a story about them demonstrating self-awareness or not, either as they currently are, or as they would be if they started to do X or Y or Z. I'll give you one more, one of my favorite ones that I mentioned earlier, amplify and reduce. I find this just really is a great way to get people to explore things if they are not quite sure. If you say to somebody, you need to do more X or less X, then sometimes that can be quite hard for them to take on board. But actually, if you say, let's just explore, what would happen if you displayed more X or less X or more Y or less Y in this scenario or in this challenge that you've already told me about? What would happen, and get them to think it through. And in fact, you can probably already see how amplify and reduce and storytelling that we were just talking about could combine together quite well.
Yeah, that'd be a really good one to use actually, because I guess with the 4 quadrants of emotional intelligence, you could amplify or reduce any of them, and discuss, I guess, what impact that would have for a senior manager or something along those lines.
Yeah, fantastic.
You could combine that with the story idea, because if you had the group just talk through, let's say, 5 or 10 items, incidents that happen in a day, just as headlines, and then go back to each of them and work out. So if you had high emotional intelligence, what would happen here? If you had low emotional intelligence, what could go wrong here?
Yeah.
I like that idea. That's really good.
Great. Fantastic. Is there some helpful stuff there, James?
Definitely, it's definitely sparked a few ideas for me. So yeah, thank you for that.
But hopefully it's kind of demonstrating how the deck can do that. And again, that's just really us using kind of, to some extent, pick a card or maybe suits. You could also use these other ways to sift the deck and come up with other combinations and so on. We could go with one more, maybe, if someone else has something they're really keen on. We don't have to. Is that I've got some drilling near me where I am. Is that annoying, loud?
It's quite quiet.
It's not coming through to me at all.
I did have some headphones, but they seem to be on the blink. Okay, I can just if nobody else wants to talk to a particular piece of content or has any other specific question, I can move towards the things I want to do to kind of wrap up and tell you a little bit about how the deck is going to be kind of sold and things like that. But if there's anything else you want to ask or any other things you want to say about how it might link with your content, or any comments, this is the first demo actually, by the way, that I've done of this now that it's in its kind of final form. So I'm very keen if anyone has any comments or thoughts.
Well, my big comment with this is I'm thrilled because when I took psych stuff, I took Kolb's learning theory and all that stuff, but I've never thought of those types of things as gaming. And seeing this deck was very reassuring to me that, okay, I'm going to get a massive amount of ideas, but, I already do pros and cons. I didn't realize that was a gaming concept. And the fact that it gave me confidence as I'm not one of you all that does all these game training type things on a daily basis. It gave me confidence that I can understand this deck and I can use it and I can do something with it.
Great. No, that's really good to hear, Sherry. I mean, I should say that I don't necessarily, it's not framed. I mean, although, this is part of Ludogogy, which is, and the Ludogogy week of playtesting, which is very much about games-based learning. It's not, this product isn't specifically sold, framed as, all the solutions are game-based learning. I think all of them could be used within game-based learning or as part of a game-based learning solution, but they could also just be part of traditional training. I think for me, where the games-based comes in and certainly the playfulness comes in, is in the actual design process of playing with the cards and kind of working with them. But definitely any of these, and just as you've mentioned with just something as simple as pros and cons, could be part of a game or game-based learning or gamifying learning. Yeah, definitely. Nice. Thanks, Sharon.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that I've really enjoyed it. I think it's really powerful, and I'm going to be in the race to be the first customer as soon as you tell us how to buy it, because I want this.
Cool, excellent. That's really good to hear, Phil. Thank you.
I definitely second that as well, and I will be making every effort to beat Phil to it so that I can be the first person to post on LinkedIn about what I've done with it.
Fabulous. Cool. No, that's really good to hear. Really good to hear.
I just asked about the you've got beginner, intermediate, and advanced level on the back of the grey cards. Beginner, intermediate, and advanced in what?
It's I mean, it's a bit arbitrary, to be honest. It's just a process. It's just kind of saying that beginner with the cards to some extent, or maybe to some extent of learning design. Start with the beginner concepts and maybe then work on to the later ones. I think if somebody was new to the cards, and certainly if they were new to learning design, and they started straight in trying to work with spreads or playing it as a game, that might be a bit confusing. So it's a little bit more just like, this is the order to go through working out of the box. You know, start with at the left, then use the first 3 roughly in that order. And then if that's all making sense to you, then have at it with the more advanced ones.
It's just about the ease or otherwise of the actual process you're carrying out, isn't it?
Yeah. I mean, but definitely, you know, if you're an experienced learning designer and all these concepts are broadly familiar to you, you know, it's definitely not set in stone. You could go in a bit more advanced if you wanted to, definitely.
Great.
And you're going to, on your forum, you're going to encourage presumably people to post their own ideas about how they could use the game, how they could use the cards, different processes that could be carried out and so on, I presume.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll go to that because it's the last thing I was going to talk about.
Sorry, preempting that.
I have questions and other things as well. This is talking about kind of how they'll be sold, including the price, but it gives me a chance to mention the forum and so on. So there's kind of 3 ways that it'll be sold. There's the deck only. We just get the deck in the post. There you go. There's the toolkit, which is the deck access to community forum, which I'm setting up at the moment. I'm looking to set it up on Discourse, which I don't know if many of you know, but it's a great forum tool which can be used on mobile as well as web. And the idea with the forum is that, as well as me using the forum as a place to post extra content and ideas on things like, here's a new theme, for example, or here's more advice on how to use this card, particularly for the complex cards. So I'm planning to do a lot of that, kind of supporting and helping and throwing out more inspiration, particularly over the time when the deck is relatively new, but ongoing as well. But then hopefully for people to start generating their own stuff there and using it as a very much as a kind of user-led forum for people to say, hey, this is a fantastic way that I found to use this card or combine these 2 cards or anything like that. And perhaps even going forwards, well, not perhaps, but going forwards to kind of gamify the forum a little bit and have little kind of competitions about different ways to use things or come up with new ideas for cards and things like that. So a lot of stuff going on the forum. I think a lot of value there. Expert updates, guides, video tips and content kind of via the forum as a tick on the toolkit box. And then, one extra thing for that middle row is a digital mini deck. So what I'm not actually going to do, because I haven't really resolved the IP concerns to my own satisfaction, is to release a PDF deck in full. So I'm not going to do that one, at least not at the moment. But what I am going to do is release a kind of a deck of little minis of PDF, which don't give all the information about each card, but do clearly have the name of the card, the number of the card, and the icon of the card and the suit, so that you can use that and use those a lot more easily actually than these huge cards which you're trying to move 52 of them around a mural. Actually 52 little mini icons that you could move around. So if you've got the physical deck in front of you, you can use these icons and use those if you're in a collaborative session with someone else who is using Mural or Miro, somewhere else in the world. So digital minis, so you could use them and refer to the physical cards, but use those as kind of placeholders or markers to do things digitally. So all of that, those 4 ticks, is in the Transform toolkit. And then Transform Lifetime, there's going to be a strictly limited number of things where you get all of that, but also you get, you've prepaid for all future Transform cards produced, and definitely already have a lot of ideas for deck 2. So there will be a deck 2, assuming that deck 1 is any kind of success, which I'm sure there will be. And then potentially even a deck 3 and some booster and promos, and then heavily discounted invites and access to all Transform workshops, which there will be some of, and events going forward. So that's just the different kind of levels there. The one that I'm recommending to people, particularly in terms of value and in terms of getting involved and getting some of the things at the forum, is that middle one. But what I'm doing is an initial kind of discount offer to a couple of groups and communities that I'm part of and that have helped with this, one of which kind of being my mailing list and Ludagogy. So if you're here today as part of this through Ludagogy, and if you'd like to join my mailing list, and I'll put the link, if you're not already on it, which I know some of you are, I'll put that link in the chat, and then you'll be able to access the discount there, which is to get the toolkit for the price of the deck only. If you do that within the initial, I think I'm going to do it for a week. So yeah, in the initial week of launch, that discount is available to you to get the toolkit for the deck price. Does that make sense?
So if you're watching this on Ludagogy and it's a week after, you've missed it.
Yes. Yeah. Good point. Well, I think a week before official launch, effectively, is that there's a discounted launch for people part of that group. So yeah, which will be very early in October. Don't have a specific date yet, but yeah. And if you're not on the mailing list, then just put in the chat the link to my website, untoldplay.com, which you can join the mailing list really quickly and easily via there.
Well, thanks, To. That's really generous offer. Thank you very much for that.
Any other questions about that, or more generally, anything else that we haven't kind of covered? Fabulous. Well, thank you very much, everyone, for coming along and for getting involved with some questions and examples. Thanks for the the feedback and comments. It's really helpful and good to hear that it's landed well for people. Thanks to Sarah for hosting this and for making this happen. And if you haven't already signed up for some of the other events as part of Ludagogy's playtest and prototyping week, then do take some time to have a look at Ludagogy and follow the links to see what else is going on this week. But yeah, thank you very much.
Yeah, I just want to say thank you, Terry, for doing this. And he's back this afternoon at 4:30. 4:30? Yes, 4:30. With some colleagues that he's been collaborating with on a humanitarian crisis game. So they'll be running a play test of that. If you want to get a ticket for that, make sure that you go to Eventbrite before 4:20, because I think that is the time that the last automated email will be going out with the Zoom link in it. So you need to be signed up before then. But yes, thank you very much everybody for coming, and thank you especially for Terry for putting this on. And yeah, I look forward to hearing from everybody about how they've used the deck when it's out there in the world.